Chapter 1. Introduction. Why painting has accompanied mankind since time immemorial. Imagine we are in a dark cave somewhere in Europe, more than 30,000 years ago. People who could not yet write, whose everyday life was characterized by hunting, survival, and the forces of nature, light a small fire. In the flickering glow of the flames, they begin to paint animal figures on the walls with earth pigments, charcoal, and ochre. Bison, horses, mammoths. Scenes of hunting, mysterious signs, handprints that act like a seal of one's own existence. Here, deep in the belly of the earth, begins something that accompanies us to this day: painting. Painting is one of the oldest forms of expression of mankind. Before there was language in written form, before books, architecture, or music were created in complex structures, it was painting that helped people to make their world visible. It is more than just decoration. It is a form of thinking, a way to capture memories, dreams, myths, and emotions. But why do people paint at all? This question has accompanied art history for centuries. Some researchers believe that painting arose out of a practical need, to depict hunting scenes, to accompany rituals, or to strengthen the community. Others see it as a spiritual tool, images as magical symbols that provide protection or make the invisible visible. Still others interpret the early paintings as a first attempt to understand the world, a visual diary of humanity. No matter which explanation you prefer, painting is deeply human. No other species has ever taken the trouble to interpret its environment in a comparable way. We find works of art in caves on all continents, from Europe to Africa to Asia. They are proof that from the very beginning, man had a need not only to experience the world, but also to capture it. But painting has not remained static. Over the millennia, it has reinvented itself countless times. It reflects the history of civilization like hardly any other cultural practice. Every era, every society, every religion has produced its own visual worlds. In the pyramids of Egypt, painting was inseparably linked to the afterlife. Scenes of sacrifices, gods, and everyday activities were supposed to accompany the deceased into eternal life. In Greece and Rome, painting became the medium of beauty, philosophy, and power. In the Middle Ages, it was transformed into a spiritual instrument that made faith visible. And in the Renaissance, finally, man self-confidently took center stage as an individual. From there, the history of painting continues to develop like a stream that branches out, finds new paths, breaks through dams, and reaches ever new shores. Baroque drama, impressionistic color explosions, expressionist screaming pictures, abstract color fields, or the gaudy pop art icons of the 20th century, all these are chapters of a great narrative that continues to this day. There is one constant: painting is never just a picture. It is always also a mirror of the times. It tells us something about power structures, about worldviews, about technological innovations. The invention of the central perspective in the 15th century, for example, was not only an artistic, but also an ideological event. Man suddenly saw himself as the center of an ordered, mathematically comprehensible world. Photography also revolutionized painting in the 19th century, because it forced artists to look for new ways beyond mere representation. Painting is thus also a chronicle of our viewing habits. What we perceive as beautiful, true, or significant has changed again and again over the centuries. And yet, something remains constant: the ability of painting to touch us emotionally. A fresco in a cathedral can captivate us just as much as a colorful painting by Van Gogh or a modern street art motif on a Berlin wall. This script wants to take you on a journey through around 40,000 years of painting history. We will look at the great turning points: the first traces in the Stone Age, the advanced civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the austerity of the Middle Ages, the explosion of creativity in the Renaissance, the revolutions of modernity, and the challenges of our present. The story should not seem dry. We want to get to know the people behind the pictures, artists who often appeared as visionaries, sometimes as rebels, who reinterpreted their world with colors, lines, and surfaces. Painting is not an abstract concept, but a living activity of people who have lived, suffered, dreamed. And again the question arises, what distinguishes painting from other media? It is quiet, unmoved, and yet full of life. It can stop time, preserve feelings, make ideas visible. An image is a frozen second, and at the same time, a gateway to infinite interpretations. Perhaps this is precisely the secret of painting. It forces us to see, not for a hasty look as we often have in everyday life, but for conscious looking. A painting challenges us to pause, to grasp colors and shapes, to guess meanings. In a world that is becoming ever faster and more digital, painting therefore has an almost meditative power. At the end of this long journey, you will see, the history of painting is also our history. It tells of man's longing for expression, for memory, for beauty and truth. In the next chapter, we will start where it all began, in the depths of the caves of Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet. There, where the first painters of mankind, long before they were called that, created pictures that fascinate us to this day.
Chapter 2. Cave Painting. Beginnings of Art in the Stone Age. When we talk about the history of painting, there is no way around the oldest testimonies of human creativity, the cave paintings of the Stone Age. Long before cities, writing, or organized religions existed, people used pigments made of earth, coal, and minerals to capture animals, symbols, and hands on rock faces. These paintings are not only among the oldest surviving works of art in the world, they are also windows into a time when man began to permanently record his thoughts and experiences. The oldest traces. The first cave paintings date to an age of over 30,000 years. Particularly famous are the finds in the Chauvet cave in southern France, discovered in 1994. Here we see depictions of horses, rhinoceroses, lions, and bears, not as clumsy line drawings, but in astonishing detail. Some animals seem to be frozen in motion. Multiple contours suggest a kind of early animation. The paintings in Lascaux, France, or Altamira, Spain, are similarly impressive. Lascaux, often referred to as the Sistine Chapel of the Stone Age, shows hundreds of animal figures, aurochs, deer, wild horses, over a length of 200 meters. Altamira, on the other hand, is famous for his powerful bison depictions, whose shapes are so three-dimensional that they still amaze viewers today. Materials and techniques. Stone Age artists didn't have modern tools, but they used nature in ingenious ways. Ochre, iron oxide, charcoal, and manganese oxides provided pigments in red, brown, and black tones. Mixed with animal fat or water, they could be used as paints. They were applied with fingers, bone tubes, bristle brushes, or by simply inflating them over the hand. This is how the famous hand negatives, red or black silhouettes of hands, were created, which look like signatures. The subsoil also played a role. The reliefs of the cave walls were deliberately included in the representations. For example, the backlines of a horse from a rock rib could be highlighted. Shadows and light of the torches made the pictures look alive. It was an art that merged with space, painting, and architecture in one. Meanings and interpretations. Why did the people of the Stone Age paint? This question remains controversial to this day because there are no clear sources. Archaeologists and art historians have developed various hypotheses. Magic function. Some see the images as part of hunting spells. By depicting animals, they wanted to gain control over them or conjure up a successful hunt. Ritual function. Others suspect religious rituals. Caves may have been considered sacred places, a transition to the afterlife, or spaces of communication with spirits. Social function. The paintings could also have served to pass on knowledge. For example, which animals are hunted or how herds move. Individual function. Finally, one must not forget. It could simply have been the joy of painting, an expression of creativity that had no immediate function. Presumably, the paintings combined several of these meanings. They were art, ritual, and communication at the same time. The role of light. A fascinating aspect is the play with light. The paintings were placed in the darkness of the caves, far from daylight. To see them, you needed torches or lamps made of animal fat. In the flickering of these lights, the animals looked as if they were moving. Some researchers suggest that the artists deliberately used this effect. The cave paintings were not static works of art, but part of living performances. Symbolism of handprints. The hand negatives and hand positives are particularly impressive. People put their hand on the wall and blew paint over it, or painted it directly. These traces are like personal signatures, testimonies of individuals who lived tens of thousands of years ago. Recent studies even show that many of these hands come from women. This corrects the idea that painting was an exclusively male activity. A global phenomenon. Although Europe has the most famous cave paintings, we can find comparable works of art worldwide. In Indonesia, there are cave paintings that are over 40,000 years old, and thus even older than Lascaux. In Australia, the Aborigines created rock paintings that are still part of their culture today. In Africa, for example in Namibia, there are paintings showing animals and hunting scenes. This proves that painting is not a local phenomenon, but a global impulse of humanity. The effect to this day. When we look at the caves of Lascaux or Altamira, we feel a connection across space and time. These pictures show that the people of the Stone Age are closer to us than we might think. They had a sense of beauty, of expression, of the power of images. Cave painting is therefore not only the beginning of art history, but also a key to understanding what it means to be human. It reflects what defines us from the very beginning, the ability to go beyond the here and now, to create meanings, and to think of the world in images. In the next chapter, we leave the darkness of the caves and step into the light of the early advanced civilizations. We travel to Egypt and Mesopotamia, where painting became not only an expression, but also an instrument of power, religion, and eternity.
Chapter 3. Painting in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Art for Eternity. When we leave the darkness of the Stone Age caves behind us, a new world opens up. Around 5,000 years ago, the first advanced civilizations emerged, cities with temples, palaces, and kings. And with them, painting also changes. Spontaneous animal representations and magical symbols now become a conscious, strictly organized art that is inseparable from religion, power, and eternity. This is particularly impressive in Mesopotamia and Egypt, two cradles of civilization whose paintings fascinate us to this day. In Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, art was closely associated with domination from the very beginning. The paintings and reliefs on palaces were not purely for decoration, but were messages. They told of kings who killed lions, of gods who exercised their power over the world, and of wars that were intended to intimidate the people. Especially in Assyria, where the kings built huge palaces, we find murals and painted reliefs depicting scenes of hunts and battles. The king appears as a superhuman figure, taller than his enemies, accompanied by guardian spirits who are half animal, half human. Painting in Mesopotamia was not a private art. It was part of a grand narrative intended to legitimize rule and symbolize order in the chaos of the world. The temples of Mesopotamia were also decorated. Colors were used to make the enormous ziggurats look alive, and clay figures or murals were reminiscent of myths and rituals. However, many of these paintings have been lost over the millennia. What remains are fragments, references to an art that was closely linked to the idea that man owes an account to the gods. While power and myth dominated in Mesopotamia, Egypt developed its very own visual language. Anyone who thinks of Egyptian painting today immediately sees the typical representations. People in strict profile, with clear contours and strong colors, embedded in hieroglyphics and scenes of everyday life. But behind this seemingly simple form is a highly complex system of symbols and rules. Egyptian painting was not an individual art, but a sacred language. Every detail mattered. People were depicted in a combined perspective. The head in profile, the eye frontally, the shoulders from the front, the legs to the sides. Why? Not because the artists couldn't do otherwise, but because it was all about completeness. A person was to be shown in such a way that nothing essential was missing. Painting was not a reflection of reality, but an image of order, an ideal.
Colors had equally clear symbolism. Green stood for fertility, blue for the sky and the divine, red for energy and life, black for fertility and at the same time for death. Every stroke, every nuance was part of a larger system. The paintings in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings are particularly impressive. Here, the pictures were to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. Scenes show how the dead receive offerings, how he is welcomed by gods, or how he does work that awaits him in the afterlife. Entire pictorial programs unfold on the walls. Boats on the Nile, fields full of harvests, festivals and celebrations. They are not just decorations, but visual manuals for eternity. But everyday life also found its way into painting. On the walls of graves, we see fishermen, craftsmen, musicians, dancers. These depictions are so vivid that today we learn a lot about the everyday life of the Egyptians. They show that art not only served the divine, but also created a connection between this world and the afterlife. Painting in Egypt was also closely linked to architecture. Temple walls, burial chambers, columns, everything could be painted. Painting was not isolated, but part of a total work of art that combined architecture, sculpture, writing, and color. And it was of an astonishing consistency. For thousands of years, the style remained almost unchanged. From the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom, we see the same basic principles. While fashion waves and breaks dominated in other cultures, Egypt held on to its visual language. For the Egyptians, this was logical. Painting should not depict the present, but eternity, and eternity does not tolerate experiments. Of course, there were nuances. In the Amarna period under Pharaoh Akhenaten, for example, the style loosened. Characters became more human, with softer shapes and more realistic features. But this phase was short. After Akhenaten's death, people quickly returned to traditional strictness. When we walk through a museum today and look at an Egyptian tomb painting, we experience a double effect. On the one hand, it seems strict, almost schematic. On the other hand, it is full of liveliness. The colors, red, blue, green, yellow, are still shining. The scenes tell of a life that seems strange and familiar to us at the same time. We see farmers at work, musicians with harps, children chasing ducks. And we realize that behind the mask-like nature, there is a deep desire for continuity, for an order that is stronger than death. If one compares Mesopotamia and Egypt, one sees two poles of early painting. In Mesopotamia, painting is often political, a tool of power. In Egypt, it is religious, an instrument of eternity. Both cultures, however, show us that painting has long been more than mere decoration. It was a medium to answer life's big questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? What awaits us after death? And perhaps that is exactly the reason why these early paintings still move us today. They are not only archaeological finds, but messages from a time when people began to consciously order their world in pictures for the first time. In the palaces of Mesopotamia and in the tombs of Egypt, we encounter the deep longing to capture the transient and transform it into something imperishable. In the next chapter, we turn to a culture that elevated the ideal of beauty and harmony to the highest form, the Greeks. There, painting developed into an art that wanted to celebrate not only power or eternity, but also the human scale.
Chapter 4. The Art of the Greeks, Ideal and Beauty. When we talk about Greek art, most people immediately think of temples, marble statues, and philosophers. But painting also played an important role in Greek culture, even if it has only survived in fragments today. Unlike the sculptures that have defied the millennia, most of the paintings are gone. Wooden panels and frescoes have decayed, colors have faded. What we know are mainly vase paintings and a few murals, supplemented by descriptions of ancient authors. And yet, from these fragments, an art can be reconstructed that embodies the ideal of beauty, harmony, and human scale like no other. The Greeks understood painting not as mere decoration, but as an art form that could train the mind. As early as the 5th century BC, Plato wrote that art could shape the soul and influence it for better or worse. Painting, therefore, had an ethical dimension. It was a tool of education. It is therefore not surprising that it played an important role in public spaces. Temples, palaces, public buildings were painted. Stories of gods and heroes were made visible. Particularly impressive are the vase paintings, which have come down to us in large numbers. Black figures on a red background, later red figures on a black background. These techniques created imagery full of movement and narrative. Scenes from mythology dominate. Heracles fighting the lion, Achilles and Ajax playing a board game, Dionysus at the feast. But scenes of everyday life also appear. Athletes competing, warriors putting on their armor, women in the house. These vases are more than vessels, they are narratives in pictures, miniatures of the Greek world. Greek paintings strove for the ideal, the beautiful body, the balanced composition, the harmony between man and the world. Early on, artists developed rules of proportion and perspective. Polygnot of Phasos, a famous painter of the 5th century BC, is said to have created frescoes that depicted the figures with psychological depth, a revolutionary approach in a time when painting was otherwise rather schematic. Unfortunately, no original has survived, but ancient sources report on the effect of his paintings, which are said to have amazed entire cities. In the classical period, painting reached a new dimension. Artists such as Zeuxis and Apelles, whose works are unfortunately only known through descriptions, perfected the illusion. Zeuxis painted grapes so lifelike that birds pecked at them, an anecdote that shows how much realism and deception were considered the yardstick. Apelles, on the other hand, court painter to Alexander the Great, was praised for his ability to depict not only bodies but also states of mind. Pliny the Elder called him the greatest painter of antiquity. More important than realism, however, was the ideal. A Greek picture rarely shows the individual with all his faults, but the human being in his perfect form. The body appears youthful, balanced, frozen in motion, but at the same time in eternal harmony. This ideal shaped not only painting, but all European art until modern times. Another important field was architectural painting. Temples were not snow white as we know them today. They were painted, colorful, decorated with scenes from myths and ornaments. The Greeks loved color, contrasts, bright representations. The reason why we think of white statues and columns so often today is because the colors have been lost over the centuries. But at that time, painting was omnipresent, filling rooms with stories and symbols. Painting also had a central function in the sanctuaries. In Delphi and Olympia, there were large picture cycles that told religious myths and immersed visitors in a sacred world. Painting was part of religion, part of education, part of public life. And yet, much is lost. The panel paintings that were admired in houses and palaces have disappeared. Hardly anything remained of the frescoes that adorned the walls. Only the Roman copies and descriptions remind us of the masterpieces of the Greeks. But even from these shadow images, it is possible to see how strong the effect of Greek painting was. It created standards of beauty and harmony that still resonate centuries later, in Rome, in the Renaissance, and to this day. Perhaps the fascination of Greek painting lies in the fact that it always balanced between reality and ideal. It showed people as they are, and at the same time as how they could be. It reflects the philosophy of a culture that placed the human being at the center, not as a weak being, but as the measure of all things. In the next chapter, we turn to Rome, the empire that admired, absorbed, and developed the art of Greece. There, painting becomes a medium of luxury and everyday life, from magnificent villas to street paintings that show us the life of an ancient metropolis.
Chapter 5. Roman Wall Painting, Luxury and Everyday Pictures. If the Greeks created the ideals of beauty and harmony, it was the Romans who transferred these ideals into everyday life. Rome was a realm of engineers, organizers, realists, and this spirit is also reflected in painting. While the Greeks often told mythical stories in frescoes and panels, the Romans transformed their homes into colorful stages of life. Especially in the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which were preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, a world of painting has been preserved that seems to us like a window into everyday life in antiquity. When you enter a Roman house, you are surrounded by colors.
The walls are not bare, but covered all over with pictures. Scenes from mythology, landscapes, architecture, still lifes, all this adorned the rooms of the rich and sometimes the less wealthy. Painting was not a luxury for a few, but an integral part of home decor. A house without painted walls was considered incomplete, almost poor. Roman paintings can be divided into 4 so-called stylistic phases, which are particularly recognizable in the finds in Pompeii. The first style, the so-called incrustation style, imitated colored marble slabs. As a result, the walls looked as if they were lavishly covered, even if they were only painted illusions. The second style, the architectural style, went one step further. It opened the walls into illusionistic spaces. Columns, windows, views were painted, so that one had the feeling of looking into another world. Whole landscapes, palaces, and gardens opened up before the eye. It was an art that blurred the line between reality and illusion. In the third style, the so-called ornamental style, this illusion was withdrawn. Instead of large vistas, fine ornaments, filigree patterns, small pictorial fields with mythological scenes or landscapes dominate. The walls now looked more elegant, more delicate, less monumental. Finally, a mixture of everything developed in the fourth style. Opulent architectural painting, ornamental subtleties, mythological scenes, and fantasy landscapes merged into a total work of art. This diversity shows that the Romans loved variety and illusion. Painting was supposed to transform spaces, make them appear bigger, richer, more alive. In the villas of Pompeii, we find frescoes that depict gardens so deceptively real that you think you can hear birds chirping and the wind moves the leaves. In dining rooms, one seems to look into landscapes. In bedrooms, there are erotic scenes that tell of love, desire, and gods. The mythological frescoes are particularly charming. They show gods, heroes, and tragedies, from Heracles to Dionysus to Aphrodite. But in the Roman context, these stories are not only religious symbols, but also decoration and status symbols. Anyone who had a scene from the Iliad painted on the wall showed not only education, but also cultural affiliation to the Hellenistic world. In addition to mythology, the Romans also loved still lifes. In many houses, there are representations of food, fruit, glasses, bread, or fish. These pictures seem surprisingly modern, almost like forerunners of the Dutch still lifes of the 17th century. They were not only an ornament, but also an expression of wealth and hospitality. Look what we have, see how abundant our lives are. That was the message of such pictures. Portraits also played an important role. Unlike the Greeks, who sought the ideal, the Romans wanted to capture the individual. Realistic, sometimes relentlessly honest depictions of men and women show wrinkles, scars, age. It was an art of remembrance, closely linked to the Roman ancestor cult. Family portraits, often as frescoes or wax paintings on wood, captured the faces of generations and were venerated at festivals. What makes Roman painting special is its proximity to everyday life. In Pompeii, we see not only gods and heroes, but also taverns with graffiti, street scenes, erotic frescoes and brothels, even advertising inscriptions. Art was not elitist, but omnipresent. It decorated not only temples and palaces, but also inns and small apartments. And yet, one should not underestimate the artistic sophistication. The Romans mastered perspective, light, and shadow in a way that was only achieved again in the Renaissance. Some frescoes show architectural fantasies with an astonishing effect of depth. Others play with color contrasts that make scenes appear dramatic. For the Romans, painting was an art of deception, but also of sensuality. It was supposed to impress, delight, and enchant. It is tragic that so much has been lost. Pompeii and Herculaneum are exceptional cases because Vesuvius covered the cities with ash and preserved the images. In Rome itself, in the palaces of the emperors, there must have been countless masterpieces that have disappeared today. Ancient writers tell of magnificent frescoes in Nero's palace, the Domus Aurea, of halls painted like skies full of stars. These images shaped the imagination of later artists. Raphael was inspired by the rediscovered frescoes in the 16th century.
Today, when we walk through an atrium in Pompeii and see the frescoes, we feel the breath of a living world. We see not only art, but the everyday life of an ancient society, the food, the festivals, the dreams, the myths, the hopes. Roman painting is therefore not only a chapter of art history, but also a document of human life. In the next chapter, we will leave the Roman world and turn to an art that was very different, the painting of the Byzantine Empire. There, the image no longer becomes an illusion or an everyday luxury, but a window to the divine, austere, sacred, mystical.
Chapter 6. Byzantine Icons. Painting as a window to the divine. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the world of painting also changed fundamentally. What had been a game of illusion, luxury, and everyday life in Rome was transformed into something completely different in the East. In the Byzantine Empire, a gateway to the divine. Here, painting was no longer understood as decoration or personal memory, but as a sacred act. It was not simply an image, but a symbol, a cult object, the visible presence of the invisible. Byzantium, which emerged from the eastern part of the Roman Empire and had its capital in Constantinople, developed its own visual language over the centuries. This language was strictly regulated, full of symbolism, and marked by deep spirituality. The central format was the icon, a painted picture depicting saints, Christ, the Mother of God, Mary, angels, or saints. Unlike Roman painting, this was not about illusion or realism. An icon should not deceive or entertain, but lead the viewer into another reality. The believer didn't just look at a picture, he looked through the picture, like through a window, into the kingdom of God. That's why icons deliberately appear flat, frontal, timeless. The figures are not lifelike, but spiritualized, enraptured, permeated by an unearthly aura. An important feature was the golden background area. Gold symbolized the light of heaven, a sphere beyond the earthly world. The viewer should not lose himself in landscapes or architecture, but immediately immerse himself in transcendence. The colors also had profound meanings. Blue stood for the heavenly, red for divine love, white for purity, purple for power. Every nuance was deliberately chosen and full of symbolic power. The depictions themselves followed strict rules called the canon. Once defined, image types have been retained unchanged for centuries. For example, there are certain standardized forms for Christ, the Blessed Mother, or certain saints. Artists did not have the task of interpreting individually, but of faithfully repeating the traditional truth. Originality was not in demand, rather loyalty to tradition was considered the highest value. Nevertheless, the creation of an icon was not mechanical work. It was prayer and meditation at the same time. Many icon painters fasted or prayed while working. The image was not produced, it was created in a process of spiritual devotion. It was believed that the divine presence could manifest itself in the image itself. That is why icons were not only contemplated, but venerated. They were kissed, carried in processions, candles placed in front of them. But this sacred role of images was not without controversy. In the 8th and 9th centuries, there was a fierce dispute, the so-called Bilderstreit. Some Byzantine emperors and theologians rejected icon worship because they saw idolatry in it. Icons were destroyed, churches were cleansed of images. On the other side were the icon friends, who argued that Christ himself had become man and should therefore be depicted in pictures. Eventually, the veneration of images prevailed, and the icon finally became the heart of Byzantine piety. Painting also played a central role architecturally in Byzantium. Churches were decorated with frescoes and mosaics that unfold entire theological programs. Particularly impressive is the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which was built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. Its massive dome floated like heaven itself, and the mosaics with golden backgrounds made the room shine in unearthly splendor. Visitors described the feeling as if they were no longer standing on earth, but had been transported to a heavenly sphere. Byzantium painting influenced large parts of the world. For centuries, it determined art in Greece, the Balkans, Russia, and even as far as Ethiopia. In Russia, for example, the icon became a central part of orthodoxy, and icon painters such as Andrei Rublev created works of timeless beauty that are still revered today.
Compared to Greece and Rome, Byzantium painting appears austere, almost ascetic. But it is precisely in this severity that their strength lies. She did not want to entertain, but to connect man with the divine. She renounced illusion in order to show a higher truth. And perhaps it was precisely this break with earthly sensuality that was to shape painting in Europe for many centuries. Because we also find similar tendencies in the Western Middle Ages. Art served primarily faith, not individual self-expression. Painting was theology by other means, a textbook for the illiterate, a way to make the invisible visible. Byzantium painting shows us that pictures can be more than just mirrors of reality. They can be symbols, gateways to another world, manifestations of faith. When we look at an icon today, we may no longer see the same thing as a believer in the 10th century. But we still feel something of the aura, the timelessness, the spiritual power of these pictures. In the next chapter, we stay in the Middle Ages, but turn to Western Europe. There, in the cathedrals, monasteries, and on the pages of the manuscripts, a very special pictorial language developed, medieval painting, which made the faith of the Christians visible and shaped entire generations.
Chapter 7. Medieval Painting, Churches, Cathedrals, and Manuscripts. If you look at the Middle Ages in Europe, you inevitably come across the paramount importance of Christianity. The church was not only a religious institution, but the spiritual center of life. It shaped thought, everyday life, and culture. And so, the painting of this epoch is also closely linked to faith. Pictures were not primarily for beauty or personal pleasure, but they were teaching aids, admonitions, devotional aids. They were intended to convey the messages of the Bible to the believers, most of whom could not read, and to make the divine order tangible. If you enter a Romanesque church of the 11th or 12th century, you will find walls covered with frescoes. In bright colors, they showed scenes from the Old and New Testaments, Christ as judge of the world, the apostles, angels, but also the Last Judgment, with the blessed in heaven and the damned in hell. These representations had a clear function. They were intended to make the doctrine visible to the faithful and to make them vividly aware of salvation, but also of the punishment for sins. The painting of this period is austere, frontal, often without spatial depth. Figures appear in clear contours. Symbolism is more important than realism. For example, Christ is usually depicted larger than other figures because his importance is paramount. Perspective, as we know it later, does not yet exist. Rather, it is about making hierarchies and divine order visible. Romanesque painting is monumental and solemn, a mirror of the certainty that the world is permeated by God. With the Gothic, which emerged from the 12th century onwards, the visual language changed. The cathedrals became taller, lighter, with huge glass windows that flooded colored light into the room. Painting also became more lively. Frescoes and altarpieces began to show more emotion. The figures took on softer facial features. The scenes became more narrative. The religious themes still dominated, but the portrayal of the human being gained an expressiveness. People began to portray feelings, the grief of Mary on the cross, the joy of the angels, the despair of the damned. A special chapter of medieval painting are the illuminated manuscripts. In the monasteries, monks copied the Bible and other writings and decorated them with magnificent miniatures. Golden letters, ornate tendrils, small scenes of saints or animals adorned the pages. These manuscripts were true works of art, often taking months or years to complete. They served not only for devotion, but also as a sign of wealth and power, because only wealthy monasteries or princes could afford such precious books. Works such as the Book of Kells from Ireland or the Carolingian Gospels, which were created under Charlemagne, are particularly famous. Here we see a mixture of text and image, of the Word of God and visual interpretation. Each page is a total work of art that draws the reader, or better, the viewer, into a world of faith. In addition to the monasteries, the emerging urban culture also played a role. Guilds and brotherhoods had altarpieces painted, which were set up in churches. These panels were often designed as polytypes, that is, multi-part pictures that could be opened and showed different scenes depending on the day of the festival.
With them, painting increasingly became a medium of public representation, not only of the church, but also of wealthy citizens. In the late Middle Ages, in the 14th century, a change was announced. Artists such as Giotto in Italy began to detach painting from the austerity of symbolism and to give people more space. Giotto's frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua depict scenes from the lives of Mary and Christ in a new, hitherto unknown naturalness. The figures no longer stand flat next to each other, but move in spaces that have depth. You can see emotions in their faces: sadness, joy, doubt. It is a step towards the Renaissance, but at the same time, deeply rooted in medieval spirituality. Nevertheless, the Middle Ages remained an epoch in which painting primarily served faith. It was an instrument of instruction and devotion, not a field of individual self-expression. The painter himself receded into the background. Often we don't even know his names. More important was the message of the picture, not the personality of the artist. When we enter a Romanesque church with faded frescoes or marvel at a Gothic cathedral with stained glass windows, we feel something of the power of these images. They were not created for museums, but for sacred spaces. They were not only intended to please, but to work, to strengthen people in their piety, to admonish them, to comfort them, to frighten them. Medieval painting shows us a world permeated by God, in which images build bridges to heaven. It was less art in the modern sense, but rather part of the life of faith. And yet, with the increasing emphasis on emotion and space, it prepared the ground for what was to come, the Renaissance Revolution. In the next chapter, we turn to this upheaval, the early Renaissance in Italy, where artists such as Giotto, Masaccio, and Fra Angelico found new ways and slowly freed painting from the rigid forms of the Middle Ages to a new view of man and the world.
Chapter 8. Early Renaissance in Italy, Giotto and the Path to Perspective. When we move from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, we enter an era of new beginnings. Suddenly, the view of the world, of people, of art, changes. What has been strictly aligned with symbols and religious guidelines for centuries is beginning to change. A new attitude is emerging. Man is no longer seen as a tiny link in the divine order, but as an independent being who is himself capable of grasping, shaping, and understanding the world. It is precisely this spirit that is reflected in the painting of the early Renaissance, and it finds in Giotto di Bondone one of its first great pioneers. Giotto, who was born near Florence around 1267, is often considered the father of European painting. His frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, created around 1305, mark a turning point. For Giotto dared to do something that was almost unthinkable in the Middle Ages. He showed people as sentient, acting beings. His figures have weight, they stand in space, they appear three-dimensional. Above all, however, they have emotions. You can see Mary's grief on the cross, the anger of the executioners, the despair of the apostles. For the first time since antiquity, the image becomes a mirror of human experience, not just divine truth. This step was revolutionary. Although Giotto's art remained deeply religious, his paintings speak to the viewer on a new level, no longer only through symbols, but through empathy. The believer recognizes himself in the faces of the figures. In this way, the biblical story is no longer just told, but made directly tangible. With Giotto, a process began that reached its full development in Florence in the 15th century. Florence was the center of the early Renaissance, a place where trade, politics, and culture formed a unique mix. This is where wealthy families such as the Medici promoted the arts, where artists, architects, and scholars met, and where a new image of humanity developed. One of the greatest achievements of this period was the invention and systematic application of central perspective. Filippo Brunelleschi, actually an architect, experimented around 1420 with mathematical rules to represent depth in the picture. Suddenly, it was possible to construct spaces in such a way that they looked realistic, that lines ran towards a vanishing point, that the viewer was drawn into the pictorial world. Painting became a window into an illusionistic world. Masaccio, a young painter, was one of the first to use this new technique masterfully. In his frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel in Florence,
Around 1425, he combined the clarity of Giotto with the mathematical rigor of perspective. Scenes such as the expulsion from paradise or the tax payment show figures of monumental force embedded in architecturally precisely constructed rooms. It is as if painting has suddenly entered a new dimension, no longer flat and symbolic, but spatial and physical. But the early Renaissance was more than just a technical revolution. It was an expression of a new sense of the world. People moved into the center. Artists such as Fra Angelico combined the new naturalness with a deep piety. His frescoes in the monastery of San Marco in Florence are of a delicate beauty that is both spiritual and realistic. The angel who announces the birth of Christ to Mary is not only a symbol, but a tactile being who fills the room with a gentle presence. The examination of antiquity also played a central role. Ruins, statues, and writings of the Romans and Greeks were rediscovered and studied. Artists oriented themselves on ancient models, looking for harmony, proportion, beauty. Painting thus became a dialogue between past and present, an attempt to combine the best of antiquity with the spirituality of Christianity. The patrons of this new art were no longer only the church and the monasteries, but increasingly also wealthy citizens and merchants. Families such as the Medici understood painting as a means of representation. A fresco or altarpiece was not only an expression of faith, but of social prestige. In this way, painting opened up to new themes that went beyond the purely religious. Although the Bible remained central, portraits, mythological scenes, and depictions of everyday life gradually found their way into art. The early Renaissance was thus a time of transition. She held on to the faith, but she put the human being at the center. She discovered nature, the landscape, the body. It combined mathematics and art, science and beauty. And it paved the way for the High Renaissance, in which artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael were to complete the ideas that Giotto and Masaccio had begun. When we stand in front of Giotto's frescoes in Padua or Masaccio's scenes in Florence today, we feel something of this awakening. The pictures are almost 700 years old, and yet they seem modern, because they speak to us as human beings. They show that painting has made the leap from the image of divine order to the representation of human experience in a world that can be experienced realistically. In the next chapter, we will see how this awakening flourished in the High Renaissance. There we find the great names of art history: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and with works that are still considered the pinnacle of painting today.
Chapter 9. High Renaissance. Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. The High Renaissance is still considered one of the most radiant epochs in art history. In a few decades, approximately between 1490 and 1520, painting in Italy reached a perfection that seemed so perfect that later generations repeatedly regarded it as an unsurpassable ideal. It was a time when artists were no longer just considered craftsmen, but geniuses. Their names are still world-famous today: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Raphael Sanzio. They combined in their art everything that the early Renaissance had prepared: the new view of man, the mathematical rigor of perspective, the inspiration of antiquity, and transformed it into works that are equally filled with beauty, harmony, and spiritual depth. Leonardo da Vinci was the symbol of the universal genius. He was not only a painter, but also a scientist, engineer, anatomist, musician, philosopher. His painting is characterized by an incredible power of observation. Leonardo studied the play of light and shadow. He analyzed the anatomy of the body. He researched the laws of optics. All this knowledge flowed into his paintings. The Mona Lisa is perhaps the most famous painting in the world, not only because of the mysterious smile, but also because of the subtle technique of the sfumato, in which the transitions between light and shadow are soft and the figures seem almost alive. Equally famous is The Last Supper in Milan, a fresco that shows the moment when Christ announces the betrayal by Judas. Here, Leonardo combines dramatic narrative with perfect composition. Each character reacts differently. Every movement is part of a harmonious whole. Michelangelo, almost at the same time, was of a completely different nature. Where Leonardo was the explorer, Michelangelo was the titan, the creator of overwhelming power. Actually, he saw himself more as a sculptor.
but his paintings are still among the greatest masterpieces of all time. This is most impressive in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Between 1508 and 1512, he painted the gigantic ceiling fresco that shows scenes from Genesis, the creation of Adam, the expulsion from paradise, the flood. These paintings are full of energy, full of monumental bodies that almost seem to step out of the picture. Michelangelo depicted man in an unprecedented size, no longer small before God, but in the image of him, strong, powerful, almost divine himself. Later, between 1536 and 1541, he created the Last Judgment in the same chapel, a work of harrowing drama. This is not so much the harmony of the High Renaissance as the transition to mannerism. Distorted bodies, whirling movements, a world in the chaos of divine judgment. And then there was Raphael, the third in the group, the master of harmony. While Leonardo sought the enigmatic and Michelangelo the monumental, Raphael was the artist of clarity and grace. His frescoes in the rooms of the Vatican, especially the School of Athens, are still the epitome of classical balance today. In this image, he gathers the great philosophers of antiquity, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, in an idealized architecture reminiscent of ancient temples. Everything is in perfect balance, every figure has its place, every gesture fits into a harmonious composition. Raphael combined spiritual depth with aesthetic beauty, and this is precisely where his fascination lies. His Madonna paintings, countless depictions of the Virgin Mary with the child, radiate a gentleness and warmth that still touch today. The High Renaissance was more than just a collection of big names. It was an expression of a new self-confidence. Man was no longer just a creature of God, but a designer, a creative being who could order the world and represent it perfectly in pictures. Painting became the epitome of the bella maniera, the beautiful way that was perfect in itself. It was commissioned by popes, princes, and wealthy families who demonstrated their power and education through works of art. In Florence, Rome, and Milan, works were created that transformed the cities into centers of culture. And yet this epoch was short. Their perfection was also their problem. After a few decades, artists began to question harmony. Some felt it was too smooth, too much created according to rules. Mannerism developed from this tension, seeking new paths with exaggerations, alienations, and drama. But for the moment, in those golden years around 1500, it seemed as if painting had reached its highest. Never before, and rarely since, have knowledge, technology, beauty, and expression been so perfectly combined as in Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Her works not only shape art history, but also our image of the human being, as curious, creative, self-confident beings who not only show the world with their pictures, but also recreate it. In the next chapter, we leave Italy and turn to the north. For even beyond the Alps, in Germany, Flanders, and the Netherlands, a rich style of painting developed in the Renaissance that set its own accents. Less monumental, but full of attention to detail and precise observation. There we meet artists such as Albrecht Dürer, Jan van Eyck, and Hieronymus Bosch, painters who made Northern Europe a second center of the Renaissance.
Chapter 10. Nordic Renaissance, Albrecht Dürer and the Art of Detail. While High Renaissance painting produced its great masterpieces in Italy, a very special form of Renaissance art developed north of the Alps. It was less monumental, less focused on ancient harmony, but instead characterized by meticulous powers of observation, by a love of detail that is second to none. In Germany, the Netherlands, and Flanders, artists created images that did not focus on the great ideal, but on reality in all its facets. The face of a person with its wrinkles, the reflection of light on a glass, the structures of fur, hair, or fabrics. This painting opened up another path to truth, not through the ideal, but through accuracy. The Dutch painters of the 15th century, above all Jan van Eyck, are considered pioneers of this direction. Van Eyck, who was born around 1390, revolutionized painting through his technique of oil painting, which he did not invent, but used with a perfection that made it the standard. With oil, you could apply colors in many layers, create transparencies, create shine and depth. This resulted in images of unprecedented vitality.
Van Eyck's Arnolfini wedding is a prime example, a room full of the finest details, from the folds in the robe to the dog on the floor, from the reflections in the mirror to the light that falls through the window. It is a picture that forces the viewer to look closely and at the same time is full of symbolism because every detail carries meaning. Hieronymus Bosch, a contemporary of Van Eyck, is also one of the great masters of the North. But while Van Eyck captured reality with great precision, Bosch immersed himself in surreal worlds. His paintings are full of fantastic figures, strange hybrid creatures, grotesque scenes. The famous Garden of Earthly Delights is a triptych that shows creation, sin, and hell in a visual language that is both fascinating and disturbing. Bosch is considered by many to be a forerunner of surrealism because his pictures make visible dreams, fears, and abysses that go far beyond sober reality. In Germany, it is above all Albrecht Dürer who became the symbol of the Nordic Renaissance. Born in Nuremberg in 1471, he was not only a painter, but also a graphic artist, mathematician, theoretician, a universal spirit who brought the ideas of the Italian Renaissance to the North and combined them with his own tradition. Dürer's self-portraits, especially the one from 1500, in which he depicts himself frontally and almost like Christ, show the artist's new self-confidence. No longer anonymous craftsmen, but individuals with their own claim to fame and importance now appeared. Dürer was a master of details. His copperplate engravings and woodcuts show a precision that reaches down to the smallest detail. Works such as Night, Death, and the Devil, or Melancholia I, are full of symbols, the interpretation of which is still debated today. His paintings, such as the Field Hair Study or the Praying Hands sheet, reveal an almost scientific view of nature. Dürer did not want to show the world in an idealized way, but as it really is, and to discover beauty in it. These trends also continued in Flanders. Peter Bruegel the Elder, a painter of the 16th century, made rural life the subject of his art. Scenes such as the peasant wedding or the children's games show everyday life in a wealth of detail that is humorous and profound at the same time. Bruegel did not paint kings and heroes, but simple people, and thus elevated them to the rank of art. His depictions of the seasons, with landscapes full of work, weather, and nature, are early testimonies of a painting that makes the lives of the many visible. The Nordic Renaissance also differed from the Italian Renaissance in its spiritual attitude. While in Italy the human being was celebrated as the measure of all things, in the North the religious seriousness remained more noticeable. Many pictures carry a deep moral message, they warn against sin, they show the transience of life. Vanitas symbols, skulls, clocks, withered flowers, are a reminder that all earthly splendor is transient. This idea permeates painting well into the 17th century. Nevertheless, strictness and joy, morality and observation were combined in the North. In a single image, one could admire the beauty of a glass chalice and at the same time read the admonition that this chalice will not last forever. This mixture of realism and symbolism is what makes the Nordic Renaissance fascinating. Compared to the High Renaissance in Italy, the art of the North seemed less monumental, less concerned with harmony. But it had its very own strength. The depth in the small, the truth in the detail, the accuracy that still astonishes us today. When you look at Dürer's Field Hair, you have the feeling that the animal could hop away right away. If you study Van Eyck's Arnolfini wedding, you will discover more details every time you look at it. This painting demands patience and attention, and gives the viewer a wealth of experience in return. Thus, in the 15th and 16th centuries, two major currents faced each other: the Italian Renaissance with its ideal of harmony, and the Nordic Renaissance with its attention to detail. Together, they form the basis of European art up to modern times. They show two ways to seek the truth: the path of the ideal and the path of observation. In the next chapter, we turn to an epoch that, after the clarity of the Renaissance, sought new means of representing the world, the Baroque. There, we will experience drama, movement, light, and shadow, a painting that not only shows, but overwhelms.
Chapter 11: Baroque, Drama, Emotion, and Illusion. After the clear harmony of the Renaissance and the precise attention to detail of Nordic art, a completely new era enters the stage with the Baroque. The 17th century was a time of great upheaval. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation had shaken Europe. New discoveries changed the worldview, and political and religious tensions shaped everyday life. In the midst of this turbulence, art sought new forms of expression. She no longer just wanted to show beauty and order, but to awaken feelings, overwhelm them, move them. This is precisely the essence of Baroque painting: drama, emotion, and illusion. Even a first glance at a Baroque painting makes the difference clear. Where the Renaissance favored clear lines and harmonious compositions, movement, light, and shadow explode in the Baroque. The pictures seem like frozen plays, full of dynamism, full of energy. The viewer does not become a silent admirer, but a player, drawn into a scene that unfolds before his eyes. A key to this effect was the masterful use of light. No artist stands for this as Caravaggio. The Italian, born in Milan in 1571, revolutionized painting with his dramatic chiaroscuro, the strong contrast of light and darkness. His figures step out of deep shadow into glaring light, as if a divine spotlight were catching them. Works such as The Calling of St. Matthew or Judith and Holofernes are full of suspense. The light is not only a technical sophistication, but carries the entire drama. It reveals the essential, it stages the sacred in the midst of everyday life. Caravaggio's influence was enormous. Successors were created all over Europe who were called the Caravaggists. In the Netherlands, for example, Rembrandt adopted this style, but transformed it into something of his own. Rembrandt's paintings are less brutal than Caravaggio's, but of a deep humanity. His Night Watch painting shows a group of shooters in a scene that is frozen like a living moment. But Rembrandt was also a master of intimacy. His portraits radiate an inner depth that goes far beyond external similarity. Especially in his late self-portraits, one sees a person who has captured his own life and suffering in color. Another great name of the Baroque is Peter Paul Rubens. He stands for the opulent, the sensual, the moving. His paintings are full of energy, full of powerful bodies, full of explosions of color. Rubens was a master at composing scenes that lead the viewer's gaze through the picture as if through a choreographed play. History paintings, mythological scenes, religious depictions, everything in his work pulsates with life. His workshop in Antwerp produced countless paintings that conquered all of Europe. But the Baroque had many faces. In Spain, it was Diego Velázquez who took art to new heights. His famous painting Las Meninas is more than a group portrait, it is a game with illusion and reality. The painter himself appears in the picture, the viewer sees what can be seen in the mirror and loses himself in a sophisticated game of perspectives. Velázquez combined the sensuality of the Baroque with a clarity that is already reminiscent of modernism. Baroque painting also flourished in France, albeit with a particular severity. Nicolas Poussin, for example, was looking for order and clarity, even in the Baroque. His pictures seem almost classical, as if he wanted to curb the drama and banish it in rules. Georges de Latour, on the other hand, who, like Caravaggio, made light the main role, is quite different. Candles illuminate his nocturnal scenes, faces emerge from darkness. The sacred reveals itself in intimate silence. Typical of the Baroque period is also the close connection between painting and architecture. Churches were designed in such a way that painting and architecture merged. Frescoes on ceilings and domes opened up rooms and made the sky itself visible. A prime example is the ceiling of the Church of Sant'Ignazio in Rome, where Andrea Pazzo created an illusion that makes the viewer believe that the church is infinitely high. This is where the Baroque illusion reaches its utmost power. The room itself becomes a stage, the painting a spectacle. Baroque painting always had one goal. It wanted to convince, to sweep away, to impress. This was especially important in the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church used art to emotionally appeal to believers and strengthen their faith. Pictures became sermons in color, not sober, but gripping, overwhelming. But the Baroque was not only religious. He was also secular, political, sensual.
In the Netherlands, where the bourgeoisie was gaining strength, countless genre paintings, still lifes, and landscapes were created. Artists such as Vermeer painted intimate scenes of everyday life. A woman pouring milk, a girl with a pearl earring. These pictures are quiet, but of an intensity that is hardly less haunting than the large history paintings. They too play with light. They also create illusion, but on a small scale, in private, not in grand gestures. But the Baroque shows itself in all its diversity, monumental and intimate, religious and secular, dramatic and quiet. But he always seeks contact with the viewer, wants to move him, does not want to let him go. It is an art that knows no distance, but it creates closeness, be it through the force of a fresco or the silence of a Vermeer. In the next chapter, we turn to an era that countered the exuberant pathos of the Baroque with a different attitude, the Rococo. There, the heaviness becomes lighter, the drama turns into elegance, and the painting shows a world of grace and pleasure.
Chapter 12. Rococo, Lightness and Elegance. After the overwhelming drama of the Baroque, the monumental frescoes and the pathetic gestures, a new mood arose in the first half of the 18th century. In a way, the Rococo was the lighter, more playful sister of the Baroque. It dispensed with thunder and force, with the struggle of light and shadow, and replaced it with grace, elegance, and a playful lightness. Where the Baroque still wanted to open the sky and overwhelm the viewer, the Rococo sought more intimacy, the private, the delicate. The name Rococo derives from rocaille, a shell and ornamental form that was typical of the decoration of this era. And just as these shells are curved, asymmetrical, and playful, the painting of this period also has an effect. Colors become brighter, pastel shades dominate, the themes are less religious or political, but revolve around pleasure, love, and nature. Especially in France, where Rococo originated, a painting developed that reflected the world of the aristocracy. Artists such as Antoine Watteau created scenes that became known as fêtes galantes, elegant outdoor parties, couples dancing, musicians in idyllic gardens. Watteau's paintings, such as The Embarcation for Cythera, show a world of lightness, full of grace and poetry. It is a world of longing, in which the characters interact with each other in a dreamy mood, half real, half idealized. Another master of Rococo was François Boucher, the favorite painter of Madame de Pompadour, the famous mistress of King Louis XV. Boucher's paintings are full of mythological scenes, which, however, are hardly intended as serious allegories, but rather serve as elegant pretexts for erotic representations. Venus, Diana, or other goddesses appear in lush landscapes, their bodies gently modeled, surrounded by pastel colors. The sensuality of the Rococo is playful, never heavy or threatening, but always carried by lightness. Jean-Honoré Fragonard also embodied the Rococo spirit in its highest form. His famous painting, The Swing, is almost a symbol of this era. A young woman swinging, laughing on a swing, her dress lifting, while an admirer in the bushes looks on lustfully. Everything about it is playful, frivolous, full of joie de vivre. It is art that celebrates pleasure and does not want to ask moral questions. But the Rococo was not only frivolous, it also showed a turn to nature. Landscapes became more idyllic, less monumental, more as spaces of pleasure and tranquility. Man no longer appears in heroic poses, but as part of a harmonious, serene world. Even the religious painting of this time often took on delicate, almost intimate forms. Frescoes in churches are full of light and lightness, angels seem playful, cloud formations elegant, the sky no longer appears frightening but friendly. Compared to the Baroque, the Rococo was an art of relaxation, an escape into pleasure. It suited the society of the 18th century, in which the nobility retreated to castles and gardens in a world of salons, balls, and parties. Painting became part of this culture. No longer a proclamation of power or faith, but a mirror of a lifestyle that enjoyed the beauty of the moment. At the same time, Rococo also had its critics. Even in his time, it became too superficial, too frivolous, too little serious for some. And indeed, if you compare it with the powerful pictures of Michelangelo or Rubens, Rococo seems like an art of play. But that's exactly where its fascination lies.
It shows a different side of being human, the joy of life, the desire for beauty, the play with love and nature. With the advent of the Enlightenment and the increasing criticism of absolutist court life, the Rococo period lost its importance. Towards the end of the 18th century, it was replaced by Classicism, which again sought strict forms, clarity, and moral seriousness. But the Rococo remained a fascinating chapter, an art of recklessness, but also of grace that still enchants today. When we look at a Rococo painting today, be it by Watteau, Boucher, or Fragonard, we feel something of this lightness. It is as if a window opens into a world in which life is a celebration, where worries seem distant and where beauty is the highest goal. And perhaps it is precisely this, in the midst of all the tragedies and dramas of art history, that is a necessary balance. In the next chapter, we turn to Classicism and Romanticism, two movements that were very different but nevertheless attempted to provide answers to the world of reason and emotion and to lead painting in new directions.
Chapter 13, Classicism and Romanticism, Reason and Emotion on the Canvas. With the end of the Rococo period and its playful elegance, a significant break took place in the late 18th century. Chapter 13, Classicism and Romanticism, Reason and Emotion on the Canvas. With the end of the Rococo period and its playful elegance, a significant break took place in the late 18th century. Europe was changing. The ideas of the Enlightenment shaped thought and politics. Revolutions shook old orders, and science and philosophy focused on people and reason. In art, this led to Classicism, a movement that demanded clarity, rigor, and moral seriousness, inspired by the ideals of antiquity. But at the same time, a counter-movement was stirring, Romanticism, which sought not reason and order, but feeling, fantasy, and the infinite. In painting, two seemingly opposing currents faced each other, but both tried in their own way to provide answers to the questions of their time. Classicism found its strongest expression in France, especially in the years around the French Revolution. Jacques-Louis David is considered the most important representative. His paintings, such as The Oath of the Horatii or The Death of Marat, embody the spirit of the Enlightenment and revolutionary pathos. Clear lines, strictly composed characters, heroic themes, all of this is reminiscent of antiquity and, at the same time, was intended to show moral role models. David's paintings are not about the individual in his fragility, but about the example he sets for the community. The hero sacrifices himself for the fatherland, the martyr for freedom. Painting becomes a political weapon, the embodiment of republican virtues. The austerity of Classicism was also evident in the coloring and form. Everything seems orderly, clear, almost cool. The characters are idealized, their gestures pathetic but controlled. Classicism wanted to educate, not to entertain. He wanted to show how one should be, not how one is. It was an expression of a time that was looking for order, clarity, firm values, and which sought antiquity as the great role model. But this strictness was too narrow for many. Romance soon appeared on the scene, seeking the opposite. For the Romantics, it was not reason that was the highest value, but feeling, longing, the experience of the infinite. They turned away from the clear forms and sought the sublime, the mysterious, the personal. Romanticism was not so much a unified movement as a stream that branched out in many directions, but in all cases emphasized the inner part of man. In Germany, Caspar David Friedrich is the best-known Romantic. His pictures show lonely figures looking into the vastness of a landscape, the sea, the mountains, the fog. Famous is The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, a man standing on a rock and looking into an endless, mist-shrouded landscape. This picture is more than a landscape. It is a metaphor. The human being, small and vulnerable, but also capable of intuiting the infinite. Friedrich's paintings are quiet, but full of depth. They do not call for political action, but for inner reflection, for a spiritual experience of nature. Romanticism also found great representatives in England. William Turner painted landscapes full of light and movement, almost abstract in their colorfulness. His storm paintings, his sea battles, his sunsets seem like explosions of color and energy.
Turner did not want to show the exact form, but the experience, the feeling of a storm, the violence of nature, the dissolution of matter in light. In his late works, one already senses the abstraction that was to come in the 20th century. In France, on the other hand, Eugène Delacroix created romantic paintings full of drama and passion. His famous Freedom Leads the People shows an allegorical female figure waving the tricolor and leading people to battle, an image that combines revolution and emotion, politics and romanticism. Delacroix loved bold colors, wild scenes, exotic themes. His paintings are full of energy, full of emotion, in stark contrast to the cool lines of classicism. Classicism and romanticism stood side by side, often in conflict, but also in exchange. While one emphasized reason, the other sought feeling. While one demanded order and clarity, the other longed for freedom and infinity. Both were children of their time. Classicism as an expression of the Enlightenment and Revolution, Romanticism as a response to the limits of reason and as an escape into nature, emotion, and fantasy. If we look back on this epoch today, we can see that two basic attitudes of art history are evident here that still have an effect today: the longing for order and the longing for freedom, for the fixed and for the open. Classicism and Romanticism are not only epochal concepts, but also an expression of two eternal poles between which art moves again and again. In the next chapter, we turn to realism, a movement that developed in the 19th century and had a completely new claim: to show the world not idealized or romantic, but as it really was, without embellishment, without glorification, with all the hardships and beauties of everyday life.
Chapter 14. Realism. The world without transfiguration. In the 19th century, a time of rapid social change, a movement emerged that decidedly distanced itself from the ideals of the classical period and the longings of Romanticism, realism. While classicism and Romanticism either clothed life in ancient ideals or transformed it into dreamy, emotional landscapes, realism wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted to show the world as it is, unadorned, sober, truthful. No heroes, no gods, no sublime experiences of nature, but the everyday life of people, with its efforts, its hardships, but also with its dignity. Realism was closely linked to the political and social upheavals of his time. Industrialization fundamentally changed life. Cities grew, factories were built, the social question became more and more urgent. At the same time, the Revolution of 1848 was a beacon. The people emerged as a political force. Old hierarchies began to falter. In this climate, it seemed inappropriate to many artists to continue painting figures of gods or romantic misty landscapes. Instead, they wanted to bring real life to the canvas: farmers, workers, ordinary people. Perhaps the most important representative of this direction was Gustave Courbet in France. His painting, A Funeral in Ornans from 1849, caused a scandal. Courbet showed the funeral of a simple man from his hometown in a monumental format that was otherwise reserved for kings or religious scenes. Here, however, peasants, citizens, priests, normal people stood life-size on the canvas, without transfiguration, without heroic pose. For many, this was an affront. Was it worthy to depict such everyday figures in the size of history paintings? For Courbet, that was exactly the program. I don't want to paint angels because I've never seen one. This attitude made realism radical. He didn't want to show anything that couldn't be seen. No fantasies, no allegories, just what existed. But that didn't mean that the images were cold or unfeeling. On the contrary, they were full of empathy for the people who otherwise received little attention. Farmers at work, workers in the quarry, women in kitchens, all of these were now given a place in art. Realism also found supporters in Germany. Artists such as Adolf Menzel painted scenes from modern life. His painting, The Iron Rolling Mill from 1875, shows workers in a factory hall shaping steel in sweat and heat. It is a monument to industrialization, full of movement and drama, and at the same time, a sober representation of the world of work. No heroic pathos, no idealization, but an appreciation of reality.
In Russia, it was the group of iterant painters, peredvizhniki, who opposed the academic tradition and painted realistic scenes from the life of the people. Artists such as Ivan Kromsky or Ilya Repin showed peasants, wanderers, revolutionaries, people who hardly appeared in official art. Repin's The Vulgar Riders is a harrowing image of men pulling a boat against the tide, exhausted, emaciated, but with a quiet dignity. Realism was thus not only a style, but also an attitude. Art was no longer to glorify the world, but to make it visible, to take it seriously as it is. This attitude was linked to the new scientific currents of the time, to positivism, which was based on observation and facts. The painter became an observer, a chronicler, almost a scientist who examined life in detail. But realism was by no means one-dimensional. He could be socially critical, as in Courbet's work, but also poetic, as in Jean-François Millet's painting, who painted scenes from peasant life, such as The Gleaners. This picture shows 3 women picking up the last ears of corn in a field, a simple motif, but full of dignity and quiet melancholy. Millet does not idealize, but he shows the beauty and importance of even the most modest activity. With realism, painting began to finally detach itself from the grand narratives. She no longer needed myths, no heroes. She was able to make life itself a topic. This was a liberation, and at the same time, the beginning of a development that was continued in Impressionism and Modernism, the turn to direct experience, to the perception of the moment. When we look at realistic pictures from the 19th century today, they often impress us with their simplicity. They are not spectacular, not overloaded, not pathic, but they are honest. They show us how people lived, how they worked, suffered, hoped. Their strength lies in this honesty. In the next chapter, we turn to a movement that developed from realism, but took it in a new direction, Impressionism. There, reality is no longer shown in sober sharpness, but in the fleeting impression of the moment. Light, color, and mood become the actual content of the painting.
Chapter 15. Impressionism. Light and Color as Revolution. Impressionism is one of the best-known and most popular movements in art history. When we think of 19th century painting today, images by Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, or Edgar Degas immediately appear in our mind's eye. Bright landscapes, scenes full of movement, colors that shimmer in the sunlight. But what seems familiar and beautiful to us today was a provocation in its time. Impressionism was a revolution that broke with the rules of traditional painting and made perception itself the theme. The birth of Impressionism is often associated with one painting, Claude Monet's Impression, Sunrise from 1872. This painting, which shows a port near Le Havre, was small format and sketchy. There were no clearly drawn contours, no accurate details, but only areas of color that hinted at the light of the morning, the fog, the ships, and the reflections in the water. When it was shown at the first group exhibition of the young artists in 1874, a critic scoffed that it was only an impression, an unfinished impression, not a real painting. This pejorative remark became the name of an entire movement, Impressionism. The Impressionists no longer wanted to depict the world in strict form or heroic narrative. They wanted to show what the world looks like when you see it, in motion, in the light, in the moment. Instead of working in the studio, they went out into nature, painted en plein air, in the open air. They sat down in front of a field, a river, a road, and recorded how the light traveled over the landscape, how the colors changed, how the moment passed. A central technique was the dissolution of the contours. The painters placed short, visible brushstrokes next to each other, which from a distance resulted in a whole, but from close up appear like pure areas of color. They dispensed with black to represent shadows and instead relied on complementary colors, blue next to orange, red next to green, yellow next to violet. As a result, the images flicker, they live, they are in constant motion. Claude Monet, probably the best-known Impressionist, devoted himself to the same motifs over and over again in order to explore the play of light. His series of cathedrals, haystacks, or water lilies show how much one and the same object changes, depending on the time of day, weather, and atmosphere. He was no longer concerned with the thing itself, but with what the eye perceives, the impression.
Pierre-Auguste Renoir, on the other hand, was the painter of men. He loved scenes full of life, dancing couples, happy parties, bathers in the open air. His paintings radiate joy and lightness. They celebrate the sensuality of the human body and the beauty of the moment. Renoir's figures are not idealized, but alive, full of light and color. Edgar Degas occupied a special position. He painted not so much nature as movement. His ballet dancers are famous, as are his racehorses and street scenes. Degas loved unusual angles, cut-off figures, spontaneous snapshots, almost like in photography, which was new at the time and had a strong influence on painting. Women also played an important role in Impressionism, especially Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt. Morisot often brought intimate scenes from domestic life to the canvas, while Cassatt, an American in Paris, painted depictions of mother and child that are characterized by great tenderness. Both proved that Impressionism was not a purely male domain, but that female artists also played a decisive role in shaping the new style. The Impressionists initially met with fierce rejection with their art. Academies and salons, which dominated the art world at the time, rejected their works because they did not conform to traditional rules. Instead, they organized their own exhibitions, an act of self-assertion that marked the beginning of modern art. But Impressionism soon prevailed. His freshness, his immediacy, his joy of life gained more and more followers. And he fundamentally changed painting. He freed himself from the compulsion to depict exactly and discovered that perception itself can be the subject. Today, Impressionism is one of the most popular art movements of all. Museums with Monet, Renoir, or Degas are crowd pullers. Her paintings seem timeless because they remind us of what we all know: the moment, the play of light, the beauty of a fleeting moment. But the story continues. For some artists soon felt that Impressionism was too light, too beautiful, too non-committal. They were looking for new ways, for more expression, for a deeper truth behind the mere impression. This gave rise to post-Impressionism, with painters such as Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin, who broke the boundaries of Impressionism and opened the way to modernism.
Chapter 16. Post-Impressionism, Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin. Impressionism had liberated painting from the constraints of the academies, from the rigid rules of perspective, from the attachment to major historical themes. He had opened his eyes to the moment, to light and color, to the joy of seeing. But precisely because Impressionism was so focused on the external impression, the need for more depth soon arose. Many artists ask themselves, is it enough to depict only the fleeting? Or doesn't painting also have to show inner truths, structures behind the visible, find expression for soul and spirit? This is how post-Impressionism was born, not a uniform style, but a collective term for various paths taken by artists after Impressionism. 3 names stand out in particular: Vincent van Gogh, Paul Cézanne, and Paul Gauguin. Each of them went their own way. Each broke the boundaries of Impressionism in a different way. And yet, they are united by the search for a painting that is more than just an impression. Vincent van Gogh is probably the best known among them, and his paintings are among the most impressive testimonies of artistic expression ever. Born in 1853 in the Netherlands, he found his way to painting late and created a huge body of work in just a decade. Van Gogh took the bright colors from Impressionism, but he transformed them into something radically new. His brushstrokes are powerful, swirling, full of movement. Colors are not merely a reflection of reality, but an expression of his inner feelings. A starry sky becomes a whirlpool of cosmic energy, a wheat field a mirror of his mental restlessness. Van Gogh did not paint what he saw, but what he felt, and it is precisely because of this that his paintings have such an immediate and touching effect to this day. Paul Cézanne, a contemporary of Van Gogh, took a completely different path. He also began with an impressionist approach, but soon he was bothered by the fleeting nature of this painting. He wanted to create structures, duration, order. His famous motto was, "Treat nature with cylinder, ball, and cone." By this, he meant that he saw fundamental forms and things. In his landscapes, still lifes, and portraits, he built the world out of areas of color that act like building blocks. Cézanne's painting is less a spontaneous impression than a careful construction. He is considered the father of modern painting because Picasso and Braque later developed Cubism from his ideas. Paul Gauguin, on the other hand, sought the truth beyond Western civilization. He was a stockbroker by profession before making art the center of his life. Gauguin was convinced that European culture was too much influenced by rationality and industry. He was looking for the original, the natural, and found it in the South Seas. In Tahiti, he painted scenes full of bold colors and simplified forms, which do not show external reality, but a spiritual, mythical world. His pictures are full of symbolism. They combine the sensual with the supernatural. In addition to these three, there were many other post-impressionists who went their own ways. Georges Seurat developed pointillism, a technique in which images are assembled from countless small dots of color. Camille Pissarro experimented with new color theories. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec brought Parisian nightlife to the screen, with scenes from theaters, cabarets, and bars. Everyone was looking for a new expression, for a further development of the Impressionist liberation. What unites post-impressionism is the turning away from mere impression and the search for a deeper truth. Van Gogh found it in the expression of feeling, Cézanne in the structure of forms, Gauguin in symbolism and the exotic. Together, they paved the way for the great currents of modernism, expressionism, cubism, abstraction. Today, the paintings of these artists seem self-evident to us, but in their time they were often met with incomprehension. Van Gogh hardly sold a painting during his lifetime. Gauguin died in poverty in Tahiti. Cézanne was long considered an eccentric. It was only later that it was recognized that they had laid the foundation for a new art, an art that was no longer bound to the outer world, but had the freedom to show inner truths. If we look at Van Gogh's Starry Night today, Cézanne's Mont Sainte-Victoire, or Gauguin's Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? Then we feel that something is happening here that goes beyond Impressionism. It is no longer the moment, it is the question of the nature of the world and of man. In the next chapter, we turn to the avant-garde of the 20th century. There we will see how artists took up the ideas of Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin and took them even more radically, in Cubism, Expressionism, and Surrealism, movements that finally catapulted art into the age of modernism.
Chapter 17. The Avant-Garde of the 20th Century, Cubism, Expressionism, Surrealism. The 20th century began with a huge upheaval in art. What Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin had prepared now led to an explosion of new styles, ideas, and forms of expression. The avant-garde came on the scene, artists who no longer wanted to continue the tradition, but who deliberately broke in order to break completely new ground. It was a time of experimentation, in which painting was no longer just a reflection of the world, but became a radical invention. Three currents stand out in particular: Cubism, Expressionism, and Surrealism. Cubism originated in Paris, the capital of art at the time. Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque are considered its founders. They were inspired by Cézanne, who wanted to reduce nature to basic geometric shapes, and took this idea to the extreme. Instead of showing the world from one perspective, they broke it down into facets, into cubes and surfaces that are visible from different angles at the same time. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907 is considered a key work. Female figures, angular, distorted, with masked faces that hardly remind us of classical beauty. It was a shock for the audience, but also the beginning of a new visual language. Cubism posed the question, why should a picture show only one view? Why not many perspectives at the same time? Expressionism emerged almost at the same time, but with a completely different orientation. While Cubism analyzed, Expressionism wanted to express feelings, fears, longings. He found many representatives, especially in Germany. The artist group Die Brücke in Dresden, with Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, and Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, painted in bright colors and wild shapes. Her pictures show big city life, nudes, street scenes, raw, direct, full of energy. They wanted to make the inner visible, not the outer reality. The group Der Blaue Reiter in Munich with Wassily Kandinsky and Franz Marc was also looking for a painting that was spiritual, symbolic, visionary. Marc painted animals in bright colors. Kandinsky went even further and created the first abstract paintings ever.
For him, painting was like music, a play of colors and shapes that triggers feelings without depicting anything specific. While Cubism and Expressionism either dissected painting or charged it emotionally, Surrealism entered the stage as a movement that made the unconscious its theme. Inspired by Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, surrealists such as Salvador Dalí, Max Ernst, and René Magritte wanted to make the world of dreams and the irrational visible. Dalí's famous shattering clocks in The Persistence of Memory show a reality that is distorted as in a dream. Magritte, on the other hand, loved to play with contradictions. For example, in his painting This Is Not a Pipe, which shows that a picture is always only a sign, never the thing itself. Surrealism opened up painting to the illogical, the fantastic, the abysmal. What all these avant-garde currents have in common is that they radically rethought painting. They no longer asked, what does the world look like? But how do we see? How do we feel? How do we dream? They finally freed painting from the obligation to depict visible reality. Instead, painting became a field of freedom, experimentation, expression. Of course, these innovations initially met with resistance. Many critics mocked the works, museums rejected them, and the public reacted indignantly. But the artists of the avant-garde were determined. They founded their own groups, organized their own exhibitions, fought for recognition. And gradually, it became clear that painting no longer just had to continue tradition, but that it had the right to revolutionize. The 20th century thus became the century of diversity. No epochs before produced so many currents that coexisted, influenced, fought, or complemented each other. Cubism opened the way to abstraction. Expressionism prepared the ground for emotional worlds of color. Surrealism led painting into the realm of dreams. When we look back on this period today, we realize how much it changed our understanding of art. Before the 20th century, painting was expected to show something. After the avant-garde, we know that painting can also be something that you don't see, but only feel, sense, or dream. In the next chapter, we turn to a current that emerged from these innovations and drew perhaps the most radical consequence: abstract painting. There, the image is finally freed from any external reality and becomes the pure language of colors and shapes.
Chapter 18: Abstract Painting, Kandinsky, Pollock, and the Liberation of Form. With the 20th century, painting reached a point where it finally freed itself from the duty to depict the visible world. Although Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, Cubists, and Expressionists had already changed the picture considerably, a reference to reality still remained recognizable in some way, be it the landscape in Monet, the geometrically broken figures in Picasso, or the expressive images of people in Kirchner. But then came abstract painting and turned everything upside down. A picture no longer had to represent anything. It could consist of colors, shapes, lines that had meaning in themselves. This marked the beginning of a completely new phase in art history, the liberation of form. The first to consciously take this step was Wassily Kandinsky. Around 1910, he created works that no longer had any recognizable representational character. He understood painting like music. For him, colors were like sounds, lines like rhythms. In his compositions and improvisations, he searched for a language of painting that would have a direct effect on the soul, without the detour via the representation of things. Kandinsky was convinced that painting could not only please the eye, but also move the mind, just as music has always done. This idea found many supporters. Piet Mondrian, for example, developed neoplasticity, strict compositions of horizontal and vertical lines, rectangular surfaces, and pure colors such as red, blue, and yellow. His paintings seem like an absolute reduction, almost like the essence of painting. Mondrian was looking for harmony, for universal laws that should find expression in form and color. At the same time, suprematism emerged in Russia, represented by Kazimir Malevich. His famous black square from 1915 is considered an icon of abstraction, a black surface on a white background. For Malevich, this was not nothing, but the 0 point of painting, a new beginning in which painting is self-sufficient. Abstract painting was therefore not simply non-representational, it was a philosophy. She asked, what is the essence of painting if you leave out everything superfluous? Color, line, shape, that's all.
In the middle of the 20th century, abstraction experienced a new flowering, especially in the USA. Abstract expressionism was born there, with artists such as Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Willem de Kooning. Pollock revolutionized painting by placing the canvas on the floor and dripping, splashing, pouring paint over it. This was called action painting, painting no longer as a representation, but as an action, as a physical act. The traces of his movements became the picture itself. Mark Rothko, on the other hand, took a completely different path. His large format canvases consist of luminous fields of color that float on top of each other. Anyone standing in front of a Rothko is literally enveloped by the colors. It is not a representation, but an experience, a meditative, almost spiritual encounter with color. Abstract painting was therefore not concerned with what you see, but with what you feel. It was an expression of the 20th century, a time marked by crises, wars, and upheavals. Many artists felt that the old language of art was no longer sufficient to capture this reality. Abstraction offered them the opportunity to go deeper, to express the invisible, the spiritual, the emotional in pure form. Of course, abstract painting did not remain without controversy. Many people asked themselves, and still ask themselves today, is this art at all? Anyone could paint that. But this is precisely where her provocation lies. She questions the expectations of painting. She challenges the viewer not to look for things, but to engage with color and form, with what painting is at its core. Today, abstract painting is an integral part of the art world. Works by Kandinsky, Mondrian, Malevich, Pollock, and Rothko hang in the most important museums and are considered milestones of modernism. They have broadened the horizons of art by showing that a picture does not need images to have meaning. When we stand in front of an abstract work, we are challenged. We cannot say, this is a tree, or this is a person. Instead, we must feel, see, open ourselves to what the colors and shapes trigger in us. Perhaps this is the greatest freedom that painting has ever achieved. In the next chapter, we turn to a movement that consciously rebelled against the seriousness and elitist austerity of abstraction, pop art. There, the everyday world becomes art, comic figures and soup cans become icons, and painting discovers mass culture for itself.
Chapter 19. Pop Art, Art and Consumer Culture. After the great experiments of abstraction and the profound seriousness of abstract expressionism, a movement emerged in the 1950s and 1960s that pushed aside everything seemingly cumbersome and focused on the everyday, the banal, the masses, pop art. What some perceived as a provocation was a refreshing liberation for others. Pop art brought the world of consumerism, advertising, comics, and the stars of pop culture to the screen, and thus turned the relationship between art and everyday life upside down. The origins of this movement can already be found in Great Britain. There, artists such as Richard Hamilton began to create collages that included advertising, newspaper images, and consumer goods. Hamilton's famous work, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing, from 1956, is considered an early manifesto of pop art. A living room overloaded with consumer goods, body images, advertising, at once ironic and fascinating. But pop art experienced its real heyday in the USA. Here she fit perfectly into a society that was shaped by the economic miracle, television, mass production, and the cult of celebrities. Artists such as Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Claes Oldenburg, and Tom Wesselmann turned the symbols of everyday life into art. Andy Warhol, perhaps the most famous figure of pop art, elevated the everyday to an icon. His silkscreen prints of Campbell's soup cans or Coca-Cola bottles show consumer products that everyone knew, but suddenly in a museum. Warhol wanted to show that art does not have to be sublime, but that beauty and meaning also lie in the things of everyday life. At the same time, he addressed mass production. His series, pictures for example of Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, or Jackie Kennedy, are deliberately repeated almost like factory goods. Here, art became a reflection on consumption, fame, and transience. Roy Lichtenstein took a different path. He translated comic drawings into monumental formats with the typical Ben Day dots, the grid dots of printing. Images like Wham! Or Drowning Girl look like oversized comic panels, colorful, striking, loud. In doing so, Lichtenstein questioned the boundary between high and popular art. What distinguishes a painting in a museum from a comic in a magazine? Claes Oldenburg, on the other hand, made sculptures from everyday objects: oversized hamburgers, giant spoons, gigantic pins. Here too, the aim was to exaggerate the banal, to transform the ordinary into the monumental. Pop art often had a double attitude. On the one hand, it celebrated the consumer world, the garish colors, the stars, and products. On the other hand, it was also ironic, sometimes critical. Warhol's repetitions of accident photos or electric chairs, for example, have a dark undertone. They show that violence and death are also part of the media world. In Europe, a separate variant of pop art developed. In Germany, artists such as Gerhard Richter and Sigmar Polke took up the visual language of advertising, often with a more critical political undertone. In France, the Nouveau Realisme movement combined the pop art idea with objects from the real consumer world. The impact of pop art was enormous. It changed the understanding of art. Anything could be art, even a soup can or a comic. Art didn't have to be elitist. It could be colorful, suitable for the masses, and directly understandable. Pop art reflected the world of the 1960s, a world of consumption, media, stars, and advertising, and made a spectacle out of it itself. To this day, pop art shapes our idea of modern art. Warhol's Marilyn pictures or Lichtenstein's comics are among the most famous icons of all. They show that art does not have to be far away from life, but in the middle of it, in the things we see, buy, use every day. In the next chapter, we turn to the present, contemporary painting after 1970, which has developed in countless directions, from photorealism to street art to digital media. An era in which everything seems possible and in which painting continues to search for new forms of expression.
Chapter 20: Contemporary Painting, Diversity and Globalization. After the revolutions of modernism and the provocations of pop art, painting entered a phase in the last decades of the 20th century that is difficult to describe with a single term. While earlier epochs were often characterized by clear styles or movements, one thing prevails above all in contemporary painting: diversity. Since the 1970s, a wide variety of forms of expression have coexisted, and globalization has brought together artists from all over the world. Today, painting is a worldwide phenomenon that no longer knows any boundaries, neither geographically nor stylistically. One strand of this development is photorealism or hyperrealism. Artists such as Chuck Close in the USA or Gerhard Richter in Germany painted pictures that at first glance look like photographs. Every detail, every reflection, every fold of skin is depicted so precisely that the eye hardly believes it has been painted. But while photorealism is often technically impressive, it is not just about illusion. Richter, for example, combined photorealistic images with abstract, blurred canvases, thus asking questions about the truth of images in general. At the same time, street art developed into a recognized art form. Graffiti artists such as Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring began on the streets of New York in the 1980s and soon found their way into galleries and museums. Her painting was direct, expressive, full of symbols and political messages. Later, Banksy joined in, who exercised social and political criticism with his stencil graffiti and blurred the line between art and activism. Another field is conceptual art, which has also influenced painting. This is no longer just about the finished picture, but about the idea behind it. Painting can be part of an installation, or it is deliberately used ironically to question expectations of the medium. Globalization has also led to the fact that Western centers such as Paris or New York no longer determine the art scene alone. Artists from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East have a decisive influence on painting today. They bring in their own traditions, materials, and themes and combine them with the currents of modernity. This creates a worldwide network in which painting is no longer tied to nations or schools, but becomes diverse and hybrid. The role of women in painting has also changed considerably. Artists such as Cindy Sherman, Jenny Saville, and Marlene Dumas have questioned gender roles, body images, and social cliches with their works.
Her painting is often provocative, direct, political, and shows that the field of art has long since ceased to be dominated by male geniuses, but has become more diverse and open. Technologically, painting has also changed. Digital media open up new possibilities. Images are created on tablets, edited on the computer, or used in conjunction with photography and video. Virtual reality and artificial intelligence raise new questions. What does painting mean in an age when images can be digitally generated in a matter of seconds? Some artists deliberately rely on the slowness of painting as a counterpoint to this flood of images. They emphasize the handmade, the material, the trace of the brush on the canvas. Others, on the other hand, merge analog and digital techniques into new forms of expression. Contemporary painting is therefore a mirror of our time, diverse, global, pluralistic. It does not know a uniform direction, but thrives on the coexistence of the most diverse approaches. Some artists are looking for new forms of abstraction. Others are returning to figuration. Some are political, others purely aesthetic. Some work monumentally, others intimately. Everything is possible, and that is exactly what characterizes this era. When we walk through major exhibitions such as the Venice Biennale or the Documenta in Kassel today, we see this diversity in all its facets. We no longer encounter painting as a self-contained discipline, but as part of a broad field that includes installation, performance, photography, and digital art. But it is precisely in this diversity that painting has asserted its place. Despite all the new media, it remains alive because it offers something that no screen can replace: the direct encounter with color, canvas, gesture. The history of painting is therefore not over to this day. From the cave paintings of the Stone Age to the masterpieces of the Renaissance and the experiments of modernity to the global diversity of the present, it shows one thing again and again: that man is a being who wants to see, represent, and shape. Painting is a mirror of our perception, our dreams, our fears, and our hopes. It has been with us for tens of thousands of years, and it will continue to do so in the future.